Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry. I'm a history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, guys, I know I'm delving into controversial territory because I'm going to be covering Ben Shapiro today. And this isn't the first time I've done that. I also reviewed his video where he tiered American presidents. Now, this video is called America's Worst Presidents. Now, whether you love Ben or you hate him, if you came in here hoping for an echo chamber to get your pre-existing beliefs reinforced, you may not actually be serious about learning. You can't do history like that. Because that's what I feel a lot of people do, especially when they are going to be watching and looking at content that is inherently political. Now, this original video will be linked down below if you want to check that out first. With that, let's get started. Now, before I check this out, I want to maybe make some predictions and see if they kind of come true. Just knowing about Ben, he kind of declares himself to kind of be more like a libertarian. I think that we're probably going to see Democrats, if not all Democrats here. And I also think that he will probably use some recency bias. And what I mean by that is presidents that either like now or within the last 10 years. And I think when you're talking about worst presidents, and with all the presidents we've had from a historical perspective, especially, probably not good to do that. Okay, you have to see long-term presidents, especially if you're gonna count all presidents. You got to see it long-term. So if it's within a decade or so, I think it's too soon to say a lot of that stuff. Anyway, because it's very easy to get into hyperbole and again, not seeing long-term effects, seeing the big picture. Anyway, all right, let's see what we got.
Who are the 5 worst presidents in American history?
5.
I've heard a lot of historians sound off on this, and they'll give you names like Donald Trump, George W. Bush. That's because they're partisan hats. We're going to talk about the 5 real worst presidents in American history.
Wait, did he just already discount? He said, and I don't know, maybe he won't be just do recent presidents, but
A lot of historians sound off on this, and they'll give you names like Donald Trump, George W. Bush. That's because they're partisan hats. We're going to talk about the 5 real worst presidents in American history.
Okay. So if they're not going to be part of it potentially for recency bias, then I assume there are others. One of the issues, I guess, that you would say I had, and whatever, his beliefs, political beliefs, whatever, I don't care. I remember in the tier video it seemed like there was not a consistency when he would talk about, things that made presidents bad. It wasn't consistent. I felt like in his tiers of where we're bottom and where we're top tiers, that they didn't like play by that same rules or consistency there. That's one thing I thought.
5th worst president, Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter? Jimmy who?
In the bottom 5?
So Jimmy Carter actually kind of pales in comparison to the other 4 because he only had 1 term to ruin America. But everybody remembers stagflation, really, really high levels of inflation and stagnation, huge unemployment rates, 8, 9, 10%, inflation rates, 14%, massive gasoline shortages, gas lines, the Iranian Revolution, which he sort of backed. I mean, he let the Shah fall, leading to the Iran hostage crisis of 1979 to 1980. He entered the presidency, pledging to reverse our, quote, inordinate fear of communism. And the Soviet Union took him up on that, then invading Afghanistan.
Okay, there's a bunch of things he's going over. So it's also hard. One-term presidents can be, I think, difficult a little bit because there's only so much a president can do or not do, in like a one-term presidency. But he brought up the Iranian Revolution, which was something that goes back to the 50s as far as the buildup of that. The supporting the Shah is what, for the Americans supporting the Shah for so many years, is eventually what's going to lead to the Iranian Revolution. Right. So he inherited a whole series of things from decades for that and was just consistent with basically with American foreign policy. So letting them fall would have assumed, like the Iranian Revolution wouldn't have happened. And if it wouldn't have happened, it would have had to be the United States like on ground intervention in Iran, which no way would have happened. That would not have been same thing with Afghanistan. So he's saying like letting the Soviets like invade into Afghanistan, that was going to happen. That's part of a bigger struggle and a similar thing because you had not to go too deep in with what's going on in Afghanistan, but basically there was a pro-sympathetic communist leader coming into Afghanistan that they supported and was also going to be ousted because of lack of support or whatever. But like it would have required the Americans to go in, and like that would never have been a case. So I feel like with this, if you're going to put it in the bottom 5 presidents, he's inheriting things that were consistent with decades of American foreign policy, and to react to them would have required things that the American public would not have been supportive.
That's all the stuff he did while he was president, but he wasn't president for that long. He was president for 4 years and 4 years only. He was a horrible post-president. He built some houses for
horrible what?
4 years and 4 years only. He was a horrible post-president. He built some houses for homeless people.
Look, it's Jimmy Carter.
That was horrible, you saying?
That's great. He also hung out with Hamas and actively wrote speeches for Uber terrorist Yasser Arafat, claiming that Hamas's election was actually legitimate. He opposed U.S. intervention in the Gulf War in Kuwait. He actively wrote letters to other members of the UN Security Council asking them to vote against the United States. That's wild. He helped broker the North of the UN Security Council asking them to vote against the United States. That's wild. He helped broker the North Korean nuclear deal that eventually led to North Korea gaining nuclear weapons. So, yeah, terrible, terrible ex-president. Probably a worse ex-president than he was even as president, which is saying a lot because he was a real crap president.
Interesting. Okay, so yeah, so they're criticizing them as ex-presidents with that stuff. So I'd be interested to think like, okay, so like North Korea is going to get technology from other communist allies for nuclear weapons, and it's like you're going to do something to prevent that. Like wanted to do that. There's a lot of foreign intervention that Ben is advocating for here. A lot of it. And is that consistent? Do you feel like he's consistent with that with a lot of other things? Like he's very pro at that. This is where people have said that he's not a libertarian because of, a common thing with libertarians is to not get involved in foreign conflicts. So if you're talking about all the ones I just talked about there with Afghanistan, with Iran, you're talking about Korea, getting involved in the politics of Gaza. And of course, Ben's going to have very strong opinions about Israel and Palestine. And I understand that. That makes sense coming from his point of view. So anyway, but I thought to put him in the bottom 5 using that criteria, I don't know. I mean, a little harsh. Okay, is he going to Obama for worst ever?
Barack Obama clocks in on this list at number 4.
Thank God for Obama.
Too recent, right?
No,
I just feel like it's recent for that, especially if you're going to do a bottom 5, like ever, of all the stuff in the early years of the U.S. where presidents were really defining America, of what America was going to be in those years. So he's done very recent presidents. I wonder how far back he's going to go.
No. Please don't bring up Obama.
To understand what a bad president Barack Obama is, you have to understand Trump is an outgrowth of Barack Obama. He's a reaction to Obama. And then Biden is a reaction to Trump. So if you're going to talk about where American politics truly went completely off the rails, the answer is Barack Obama.
So yeah, it's interesting because, again, you're saying that there was and I understand that a lot of presidents are elected in reaction to previous people. If you do that, you also have to go back really, really far. I've actually been, I've kind of said this too, because I've heard this, talked about a lot, like with Trump being like a reaction, if you want to say, to Obama. And my thought has been, I don't know what you guys think about this, but that it's more than that, because Trump was an outsider of the Republican Party, and they did not go with the status quo of the Republican Party. I kind of feel like with when again trying to look at history here, right? That Trump was a reaction not just to Democrats before him, but to his own party, because he went and separated himself from the Republican Party completely, went after all of them. And if you guys remember in the early days of him running, all the different candidates, the status quo guys that have been in kind of the big kids table of the Republican Party for a long time. And he went off and was, I feel like, a reaction to them. He enabled a lot of voters, or brought in a lot of voters that, probably would have voted Republicans, but never really felt like they could or wanted to. He activated a lot of people getting involved in politics in the first time. And I think it's because he was a reaction, not just to like Obama, but to their own Republican Party, to just the establishment as a whole. That's kind of been my feelings and how I've looked at it, because he's not a traditional run-of-the-mill Republican. He did not come up through them like so many of them do. He went on completely on his own path.
Barack Obama came into office as a unifier.
I'm so excited because we are going to change the world.
And then he proceeded to radically divide the American population. Yeah. You can see it in the polling
Everyone
data.
Says they're going to 72% unify, and they never do.
Thought race relations were good in 2013. So did 66% of black people.
What is this study?
By 2015, that number was 51% of blacks and 45% of whites.
I'm trying to see. Do you guys see a source for anything here?
in the
What's
polling
this
data.
poll?
72% of white adults thought race relations were good in 2013. So did 66% of black people. By 2015, that number was 51% of blacks and 45% of whites. Barack Obama's racial polarization was dramatic. He presided over race riots in Ferguson and Baltimore. He promoted the lie that police officers all over the United States are racist, contributing to the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, raising crime rates around the country.
These young men are incredibly angry.
He presided over the weakest economic recovery in modern American history because his decision was he was going to spend endless amounts of money and regulate the living hell out of the economy. The Congressional Budget Office.
What do you guys think about that? Because it's coming into that, into 2008 was our worst recession we had since the Great Depression. So like the recovery of that, when you rate how it was it understandable? You know, was it good? Could it have been more? If so, how do you know it could have been? What would that have required? Do you think that would be a difficult thing to put completely? Now, Obama was two presidencies, right? So, or 2 terms. So, I mean, that's a lot longer than what he was than like Carter and stuff like that. But yeah, definitely true that if we were coming in as some kind of uniter of things, that definitely didn't happen. A lot of people come in always saying they're going to unite the different sides and stuff like that, but. Yeah, you can definitely say, you know, racially, a lot of things came to the forefront, no doubt.
Initially said that Obamacare would cost $940 billion. It has now been estimated it will cost $1.7 trillion. Life expectancy in the United States in 2010, when Obamacare kicked in, was 78.54. Today, it is 77.28. So, nailed it with Obamacare.
So putting that on Obamacare.
Today, it is 77.28.
It's not like the majority of people signed up for that, too. It's still, you know, heavily privatized right there. The Obamacare thing was kind of interesting for people, how they perceived it too, as it's supposed to be this market for people to be connected with different providers and hopefully allow them to compete to get lower prices and stuff. Do you think this is this drop? Okay, you're talking a year. Right? Do you think that is, and we're going to 2020, so about COVID, so you can't really bring that in. Do you think this is more a causation or is it more correlation? You think this data as well, the life expectancy, and tying it to Obamacare?
So, nailed it with Obamacare. He polarized the country on social issues, including most prominently same-sex marriage, where he simply decided to reverse his position from 2008 on same-sex marriage and declared that everybody who actually held his position from 2008 was an evil, bigot, terrible person.
Marriage is between a man and a woman.
He utilized the IRS.
This is something you saw with the Democratic Party happen a lot. The Clintons were the same way for a lot of time. A lot of kind of mainstream center left, I guess, center American left, right? Changed a lot of their attitudes on social issues over the last 30 years. That's definitely true.
To target his political opponents, he weaponized the DOJ under both Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch. He presided over the use of the FBI to target Donald Trump in the 2016 election. On the foreign policy front, he alienated traditional allies like Israel, sending pallets of cash to America's enemies like Iran. He basically ceded all of Crimea to Russia and then ceded leadership in.
So that's interesting. You're like ceding it. Is interesting because it's not like the United States controlled Crimea, nor is Ukraine an ally of NATO. So that would have also then have brought in the idea that, you know, Ben believes there should have been intervention of some kind. And you could see kind of with Ukraine now what that would have looked like. Just like supporting Ukraine hasn't stopped Russia from doing their thing there. You would think it would probably be a similar situation back with Crimea. You know, okay, what would you do? Would you financially support the Crimeans there? And remember in Crimea too, they had a referendum, which from what I understand, okay, what I've heard, they had a referendum and even by Western accounts thought it was a pretty legitimate vote. At least from what I understand, if you got something to counter that, you can post that. But that Crimea, the voters were actually very pro annexation, I guess you call with Russia there. So again, it looks like he's advocating for a lot of foreign intervention with a lot of these presidents.
Syria to Russia. He destabilized the Middle East by backing the Arab Spring, radically pulled American troops out of Iraq and led to the rise of ISIS. And by the way, he spent more money than all prior 43 presidents combined.
So he would have wanted to stay in Iraq. Is that what he's saying? By the time he became later in his presidency, people want to back. And look at today. I mean, how many people do you hear today talk about, you know, how with Iraq, you know, or Afghanistan, which saw presidents of different political parties over the last 20 years, it seems so unpopular now. Now, growing up, when it was, for me, like when that was happening, people were very pro intervention and thought that was a good thing. But it seems like today it's kind of done what Vietnam has done, which is most people saying that was like a pointless thing. But I don't know if he's saying he's advocating for that. Is that his position that you guys know that may know Shapiro a little more?
My credit card still works.
So yeah, terrible president. Third worst president of all time. Most people label him the first, but I actually don't think he matches up. Is James Buchanan. Saying that James Buchanan is the worst president of all time is a little much, considering that it would have been on him to stop the Civil War from happening.
By the way, this take that he's having right now, because now we're going back and we're looking at historians and we're seeing effects, is very widely beheld. Buchanan is not seen very positively by historians and people of different political opinions. This is where you're starting. The first time I think you're going to see people agree more, I think, on his list, right? Especially when you go further back and not dealing with such the recency bias. So really with him, it's going to be delaying the Civil War and not, you know, trying to attempt
James
to fix
Buchanan,
those
in the lead up
problems.
to the Civil War, endorsed the view that whatever the Supreme Court said about slavery would be obeyed. He actually knew the outcome of Dred Scott, which essentially ruled that black people were not citizens of the United States and could not be citizens of the United States beforehand when he said that. He was a Pennsylvania Democrat, very, very sympathetic to Southern slavery positions. In his inaugural address, he called the issue of slavery, quote, happily a matter of but little practical importance. Wrong. He actually said that while secession was illegal, the government didn't have the power to stop it, which led a lot of states to be like, okay, well, then I guess we can leave. Again, could he have prevented the Civil War from happening then? Maybe?
That's kind of what I was going to ask, like if he thought that the Civil War could have prevented. Don't you think that was just a train? I mean, that was out of control for some time. You know, like, can you put all of that on Buchanan? Can you go back to when the Constitution was written and 3/5 compromise, you know, still allowed for slavery to exist, even though the slave trade was going to continue? Could it have been achieved without war? I mean, the biggest problem with all this for Buchanan and the guys before him was Western expansion is what was screwing up the slave issue for a lot of it. Okay, 1848, Mexican-American War is over, new territories coming in, eventually get Texas and stuff like that, and all these new territories, they are going to need to decide about slavery, right? And people debated upon that, right? Because before that, and before, you know, and then as territories of the Louisiana Purchase were getting statehood and territory status, had to decide, you know, if they're going to be slave states or free states. And as you know, for decades, the policy was you'd add pretty much two. You'd add one that's a slave state, one that's not a slave state, so that it would even things out that way when you're talking about like representation in Congress between slave states and non-slave states. But then it kind of came to a head eventually with all this Western expansion there.
Although obviously the circumstances were building toward the Civil War pretty clearly. That's the only reason I don't have Buchanan as like number one on this list of crappy presidents.
Glory, glory, hallelujah.
It'll be Johnson. Anyway, he very polarizing president that way, being a Democrat that a lot of people talk about with attitude shifting of the Democratic Party, him being a key component of that, as you know, it's going to push civil rights issues and stuff like that, push civil rights legislation, and gets a lot of kind of chrism that as like a Southern Democrat.
Second worst president of all time, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Utter disaster area.
So what I'm going to think about, what I'm going to be wondering if he's, I can't imagine Ben's going to say like the Civil Rights Act was bad or something like that. So this could be a pretty hot take depending on how he goes after. There's plenty of things to go after with LBJ there, with things that were happening with the government, but a lot of things it would probably be very spicy to say with him, especially when it comes to civil rights legislation push.
Literally the only good mark on LBJ's record is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Those are the only good marks. The big boo-boos for LBJ, the Great Society. So the Great Society was an attempt to, quote, fight the war on poverty. This amounts to spending trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars.
This kind of reminds me of with the Great Society. He was influenced by FDR quite a bit, and FDR was big about government's role into involving economic issues. Now that a lot of that was coming into from the Great Depression, which isn't necessarily what, it's definitely not what LBJ was coming out of, to increase government spending and stuff like that. So yeah, if you're somebody that doesn't like that, government spending kind of thing, then you're probably,
making government encroach into nearly every area of American life, offering subsidies, threatening prosecutions and fines. Government
Medicare and Medicaid came out of that, by the way.
The prospect of intergenerational poverty through sponsorship of single motherhood through welfare programs that disincentivized marriage. The black single motherhood rate in 1960 was under 20%, and the black single motherhood rate today is above 70%.
So he's saying it's encouraging people to stay with, or to stay with their significant other, especially women with men, in instances of unwed pregnancies.
The black middle class actually expanded way faster before the Great Society programs than they did after. According to the Cato Institute's Michael Tanner, between 1963 and 2010, the federal government spent $13 trillion fighting poverty. The poverty rate, by the way, in 2012 was 15%, slightly higher than it was in 1966. So he spent $13 trillion to increase the poverty rate. He got America deeply involved in the war in Vietnam.
Yeah, definitely. It doesn't sound like good spending, does it? If it's supposed to end poverty. The war on poverty is such an interesting thing of, can you do that without fundamentally changing the economic system of the United States, which this did not do at all, right? This did not fundamentally change that, not in the long term. You may have temporary easement for people. By the way, I said this and then I forgot. Shapiro, what is his thought about Medicare and Medicaid with that too? Because those came out of that too, which are things that are major parts today for health and for elderly people.
Disastrous war in American history.
Support.
Even if you believe that we should have been involved in the war in Vietnam, if you're going to go in, you go in with overwhelming force and you break things and you win the war. That is not what LBJ did.
Should have gone harder.
He presided over serious racial unrest. Christopher Caldwell writes in his book, The Age of Entitlement, the changes of the 1960s with civil rights at their core were not just a major new element in the Constitution. They were a rival constitution with which the old one was frequently incompatible.
So I was wondering about Vietnam, because he's been talking about there should have been different approaches or possibly intervention with all those other issues too. So for Vietnam's one of those things too, just like Afghanistan and Iraq, that went through multiple presidencies over 20 years, and pretty much had the same policy for every one of them. Going back from Roosevelt all the way through Nixon, right? Or not Roosevelt, sorry. Eisenhower to Nixon there, that saw a lot of things. So putting that in there, it gets expanded as well greatly in this, and then into the Nixon administration. It did get actually way bigger, expanded the war, which still did not end the war. So
the federal
get another thing that if you had increased by the end of the war, more American troops, the war was growing increasingly unpopular.
Extraordinary power to end discrimination, both real and imagined, both in the private sector and in the public sector. As Caldwell writes, when instances of racism couldn't provide the proper pretext for government interventionism, the rubric of anti-discrimination was expanded.
That's what that say? Critical rage theory? It's communist.
Couldn't provide the proper pretext for government interventionism. The rubric of anti-discrimination was expanded to include any supposedly victimized minority group. So this paves the way for the LGBTQ plus minus divided by sign movement. The civil rights models of executive order
plus
litigation.
Divided minus sign? Oh, he's mocking it.
LGBTQ plus minus divided by sign movement. The civil rights models of executive order litigation, court-ordered redress eventually became the basis for government to do what the Constitution would previously not have permitted.
In 1913, Woodrow Wilson.
Not have permitted to do like stuff like that on a national level, to have the Supreme Court come in on things like Roe v. Wade or gay marriage and stuff like that. Is that kind of what he's saying? So yeah, a lot of criticisms there for LBJ. It looks like he focused on the economics and how the economics failed to, I guess, fix the racial problems. He's kind of he's tying those two together there. So, but yeah, with the he definitely was a big government spender and stuff like that, and definitely didn't help with the debt, right? All right, he's going Wilson. All right, well, this is another thing that you see people on all sides on, is definitely President Wilson.
Wilson takes us into World War I.
The worst president in American history, bar none, Woodrow Wilson. First of all, he was an authoritarian. He actually wrote, quote, "The president is at liberty, both in
paging
law
Chris from Vlogging Through History here. Paging Chris.
and conscience, to be as big a man as he can. His capacity will set the limit." He actually believed that the presidency of the United States was really the only branch that ought to matter. The idea is that experts in the executive would be able to do things and react more quickly than the antiquated checks and balances of the Constitution. On the moral level, Wilson was just
he was
craptastic. He was a fan of eugenics. He actually pushed for compulsory sterilization of
Wilson was rough
Down
with that
syndrome
stuff.
in 1907. Before he was president, he even signed a compulsory sterilization bill while he was governor of New Jersey in 1911. Famously, he promised to keep America out of the war in his re-elect effort in 1916, then got America involved in World War I by helping to blockade Germany. And then when Germany attacked American shipping, got America directly involved in World War I. His attempts to broker a peace at the Versailles Conference ended in utter disaster and probably paved the way for World War II.
Okay, so there's some things going on here. I don't know if he's advocating necessarily for not going into the war or whatever of whatever he's saying here. I mean, it's true. Wilson, he went in as somebody that was actively trying to keep the U.S. out of the war, and when he ran for re-election, he campaigned on that. It was a major campaign thing, is vote for the president that's kept us out of the war. And usually with Wilson, because I see a lot of criticisms of him, are not involved with World War I. There's a lot of things that a lot of people like about Wilson, about how the approach was very, gradual as far as not going in right away, because that was American policy too. You're still going with like Monroe Doctrine and U.S. trying to stay out of European conflicts and focus on the Western Hemisphere. And people did not want to go to war. The people in the United States did not want to go to war then, did not think that was their fight. But yeah, there was definitely things that harmed, like U.S. with Wilson trying to stay neutral, but actively going into the war zones and sending merchant ships. And there was all kinds of deals about trying to keep, the United States would not bring in war materials and stuff like that. We know that was being smuggled in. We found that out with the Lusitania that was having ammunition like smuggled in. So I guess you could say that for criticism for him in World War I was they could have done more to stay out of it by not getting involved at all. And what I mean by that is not fighting, but trading, exclusively with the Allies there and having those issues with Germany. Now, as far as him criticizing, I don't know if Ben's saying that he thought Wilson had true power coming into the Treaty of Versailles, because he comes in with the 14 points, which when you look at the 14 points are good ideas, right? That are out there, and you can go through them, but they're good ideas. Very few went in, but you got to remember the Americans were not going to be considered the head of this treaty. That was not the case. Americans came in late. It's the British and the French are the ones going in there and are the ones pushing for more of the treaty, trying to punish Germany. There's really not a lot of Wilson do, because remember this too. Wilson proposed like the League of Nations and trying to get all done too. It was not him. It was not Wilson that did not want to join the post-peace process. It was Congress. Congress did not want the U.S. to join the League of Nations and blocked it. They did not want the U.S. to get involved in future European conflicts, and did not want the League of Nations to be able to like declare war on the behalf of the United States. The United States never joined that. Wilson wanted them to. Okay. So the World War I stuff, kind of interesting to see kind of his take on that. But yeah, the social issues for Wilson are yikes. And Ben's hitting it absolutely correctly there. He didn't really talk about some of the racial stuff, but that was horrible too. There's a lot of racist stuff going on within that. And I know you can do a lot of people were racist at the time, but like Wilson was, there was a lot of government intervention and policy and stuff that very much hurt. And the KKK was rebuilding like at that time too, and not much was going in there. So social issues, it's a bad look for Wilson, and Ben was right there.
And shipping got America directly involved in World War I. His attempts to broker a peace at the Versailles Conference ended in utter disaster and probably paved the way for World War II.
Not his fault, though.
He curbed civil liberties via his Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, and he helped press forward the Sedition Act of 1918. That actually made it a crime for American citizens to, quote, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing about the government. Wildly unconstitutional. He nationalized major American industries, including the telegraph industry, the telephone industry, railroad industry. He created a massive economic recession that actually developed into an outright economic crisis in 1920. On the racial front, disaster area.
Economic crisis all over the world that time too. But yeah, the U.S. Saw the least of it as the least economically affected of the major powers as affected by World War I.
Resegregated the federal services. He presided over major race
Segregation
riots. He showed
issues.
Birth of a Nation at the White House and called it writing history with lightning.
Yeah. The Birth of a Nation.
Race riots. He showed Birth of a Nation at the White House and called it writing history with lightning.
Yeah, so that movie, if you don't know, basically like glorifies the KKK. It's also one of the first like films, like popular films, and it was like a new technology. Aired it at the White House, so it was like, writing history with lightning, which is honest, like right there is kind of a cool phrase of like somebody experiencing what film was like. That's what he was referring to in that quote, is writing history with lightning. But it's also not very good to use something like Birth of a Nation as that, because it is a very racist movie.
And by the last couple of years of his administration, he was not even in charge of his own administration.
Oof.
His brain was actually non-functional, and it was Edith Wilson who was actually governing.
Yeah, he had health
at
issues
that point. So a terrible president, economically terrible president, terrible wartime president, terrible president on race, terrible president in terms of structuring a mass.
One of the things that amplified his health problems was his campaigning for League of Nations stuff. He campaigned around the country, and it took a major toll on his health.
Federal bureaucracy. Just a horrific President Woodrow Wilson. If somebody says George W. Bush was the worst president ever, really? Did George W. Bush show Birth of a Nation at the White House and stand for eugenics and get us into World War I leading to World War II?
I say the same thing. What he was saying about there's a lot of recency, and like Bush, you putting in the bottom five. I mean, maybe people will one day. We're still seeing the effects, coming out of involvement in the Middle East. We're still living through that. So even I sometimes have a hard time, even though with like Bush going back that far. To me, it's almost like you can't do this century almost. I don't know. Maybe that's too hard. Maybe that's too far back, but I don't know. What do you guys think about maybe the 10-year kind of thing? It's hard to compare presidents with all other presidents when it's only been about 10 years, since they started. So I don't know. What do you guys think about that? At what point can you really fairly put them in and compare to?
And also declare himself kind of a dictator? Did he do those things? No. His two big failings, the Iraq War,
why is he jumping in
the economic crisis of 2007, 2008. That crisis was not of his making. That came from the Clinton administration. It was their attempt to push subprime mortgages down on the banks and allow bad borrowers to take the money.
So he's doing the thing where, do you think he's been consistent with this about talking about economic issues not being the fault of one president? Because do you think this is consistent? Like he talked about the economic issues of Obama, but not talking about the recession under the Bush administration. But then he also, didn't he just bring in Bush and those economic problems, but bringing that back to the Clinton administration? I don't know if do you think that's consistent?
As the Iraq War had wide bipartisan support.
That is
and
very
then there's
true.
Trump. When people say that Trump was the worst president ever, what they're really referring to is his rhetoric, the bad tweets, whatever kind of weird
Way
stuff
too
he was
soon.
saying.
Can't do anything with
In
Trump.
terms of policy, not even close. Trump presided over a massively booming economy. He put conservatives on the Supreme Court to actually reestablish the checks and balances set up by the Constitution. He helped actually broker peace in the Middle East, which used to be a Nobel Prize thing, and now everybody just ignores because Trump did it. He kept Russia and China.
Peace in the Middle East and all that. I mean, it'd be hard to say that, right?
Largely in check. He's the first president in my lifetime who didn't get America involved directly in a foreign war. The notion that Trump is even...
There was wars fought during then, still going in Afghanistan, Syria also still being a part of that.
remotely near the top of the list of worst presidents ignores a lot of very, very bad presidents.
That's true, though. Yeah, no, Ben's right about that. He's very right about that. Is that it? All right, final thoughts. All right, so what do you guys think about Ben's list there? What do you think about his criteria? With that, he's talking about worst presidents. He brought in only one from the 1800s, one before World War II, and then the three others were all very modern presidents there. Do you think that criteria was good, that kind of he was going for there? Do you find that there was consistency or inconsistency in kind of how he analyzed things? Again, just knowing, because I've obviously studied a lot of people's different opinions about about presidents and stuff like that. So like seeing Wilson and Buchanan, very common to see those guys as bottom 5. And there's great, there's very good arguments for that. Other than that, who else do you think should be in a bottom 5? With that too. And what do you think about the recency bias kind of issue? Do you think that's fair? Where do you think a good timeline is to be able to accurately compare a modern president with presidents of decades or centuries past? Where do you think that should be? And anyways, okay, with that, love you all. Be civil to each other, and we'll see you next time.